Have you ever wanted to make your own show-stopping K-pop inspired hat? The kind that instantly gives main character energy? Well, today I'm going to show you exactly how to make it from start to finish. This is my Jinu-inspired hat, a bold structured felt piece with that iconic dramatic brim. And the best part is you can grab the pattern down below and sew along with me. Hi, I'm Christina, a digital pattern maker who loves to create wearable art that I can wear and share. I help creative sewists like you turn fabric into wearable art and learn how to bring their favorite designs to life, starting with digital pattern making, then into sewing. So let's dive on in and start making Jinu's inspired hat. I began with pattern drafting his hat in Clo, but I wasn't sure of the size, so I wanted to first test it out. I then cut it out in paper and taped it together. This was a really handy way to not use any really expensive materials, but then still be able to have my husband try it on and see how it worked or fit on his head, see if we wanted to lower the crown, which we did a little bit, and we did take the brim in a ½ inch on either side, so 1 inch total, because it was a little wide. So then I went back into Clo and made those slight alterations so that the final pattern is ready. Once the final pattern is ready, I'm going to go ahead and project off the pattern using patternprojector.com. This is a super handy website for anybody who loves projectors. I talk about it quite a bit and I cannot recommend it enough. I love how quick and easy it is. I'm going to go ahead and lay out my fabric. I am going to lay this out on the double because I am going to do 2 layers of my brim. I want to do this because I want to give it a little bit more structure and a little bit more sturdiness. This felt that I'm working with is a little bit thin, so I wanted to create kind of like an internal structure. So I'm going to use some fusible webbing and fuse the top and bottom of the brim together to help give it a little bit more stiffness and a little bit more thickness. I'm going to trace off my stitch line around the center. The outside of this brim does not have any seam allowance because I'm just going to be binding it off. I did not add any seam allowance, so if you are hoping to do it differently, note there is no seam allowance built into the brim of this hat. So if you want it a little bit wider, a little bit thinner, or you're planning to finish it a little bit differently, just know there's no seam allowance in the brim part of this pattern. Then it's time to cut it out. There we go. Now that the 2 brim pieces are cut out, it's time to move on to the crown pieces, both the top circle as well as the crown side pieces. These ones, I only am going to be needing 1 layer of felt. I'm going to unfold my fabric so that I'm only cutting 1 layer. Then I'm going to move to those pattern pieces on the projector so that they're nice and close and I'm not reaching quite as far across the table. And then I am going to trace the stitching lines that I want. I always like doing stitch line to stitch line sewing, especially when it's around circles or anything that's going to be tight. So I'm just going to take my chalk and chalk around all of my stitch lines on the brim of my hat. Then it's time to cut this piece out and move on to the top crown. Again, we're going to place the pattern piece close to an edge. Then I'm going to fine tune it by just moving the felt to where I need it. I'm also going to chalk around my stitch lines of the circle as well as mark my 4 points, so I know where this circle attaches to the crown. I find with circles, it is most important to always mark those notches so that you can easily figure out where everything goes and you don't end up with a weird gathered circle in that's a little asymmetrical or other problems that can happen. The last thing I need to cut out is the webbing. So I have this webbing that is backed with paper that is really helpful when you're wanting to fuse 2 pieces together. I can cut this webbing out, fuse it to one side using the paper side, peel the paper off, and then fuse the two pieces together. However, it does not come in a super wide length or super wide width. So you will need to piece the webbing together. Not a big deal at all, super easy. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut out the size of webbing for this hat that works best for me. Then I'm going to move over to my ironing board and start pressing. This is a very long, slow process. When you're ironing on the webbing, it needs at least 10 seconds per little area. So it's sometimes letting your iron sit there for 10 seconds, moving it a little bit and letting it sit there for 10 seconds. This is a wide surface area to be doing that on. So it is a little slow, and I could tell when I was getting impatient because I kept wanting it to go faster and I wasn't getting it fully fused down. So I always recommend take your time and don't move too quickly when you are fusing. Once it is all fused together, you can pull off the paper pieces. I do not recommend throwing those pieces out right away because if you still have areas that you want to repress before you add on the top area, you can relay that paper down to press some more. I did have a little overhang on one of my sides, so I'm going to trim down that excess webbing that I don't want to get my ironing mats all gunky with. Then I'm going to go ahead and place the other hat brim on top and begin ironing it down. This again is going to take some time because you have at least 10 seconds for everywhere that you want it to really bind, and you want them to bind really, really well. So take your time with this. Know that it's going to take time, but it will be well worth it in the end when they are completely fused together. Now that everything is fused, it's time to move over to the sewing machine and create the hat. We're going to start with sewing the side seam, or that back seam really is what it is, of the side crown. We're going to sew this top to bottom, edge to edge. Sometimes when you're sewing these types of things, you don't want to go edge to edge, but we do want to sew through that seam allowance at the top and bottom. We're going to jump over to our ironing board really fast and iron open that seam. When working with felt or wool, I also love to have a little clapper that helps push that seam and give it a really nice crisp look. And now it's back to the sewing machine to attach the crown top part to the crown side part. You will want to make sure that you match up your 4 points on the crown top to the 4 points on the crown side. I forgot to mark the ones on my crown side, which is not very good. So I'm going through and I'm folding my hat into quarters so I can make sure that I am lining everything up beautifully before I sew it. So when you're cutting it out, don't forget to mark those notches. I'm now working my way around, matching up those notches and pinning the crown top to the crown side. I always start by pinning my 4 notches and then easing in between everything. I also am making sure that I'm pinning stitch line to stitch line so that everything looks beautiful and is the exact pattern I drafted. Once the pinning's done, it's time to sew it. I'm going to start and sew all the way around, pulling my pins as I go. Once you're done sewing, you're going to want to move back to the ironing board and press open this seam. Once it is pressed, we're going to attach the crown to the brim. we're going to do it in a very similar fashion. We're going to line up the 4 notches of the brim to the 4 notches of the crown. I always like to line up the notches first and then make sure everything is easing in between those notches. If you are struggling to make the 2 lines easily match each other, you can clip into the seam allowance of the brim. This will help let the tinier circle kind of release and will allow it to relax the fabric around to fit the crown bottom stitch line. So if you're having issues, just clip a little bit. Make sure you never clip through that stitch line, only through the seam allowance. Once you are done pinning, it's time to pull that sewing machine back towards you and stitch this together. I'm going to sew around slowly, pulling my pins as I go so I don't accidentally hit it weird or break a needle because it hit my pin. Once I'm fully sewn, I'm going to move back over to the ironing board, clip in if I didn't clip in before to actually ease it around as I'm sewing. This is going to release it so that the size of the outer circle is the actual size and will fit the person's head. This is also when you're going to want to press open that seam and press it back a little bit. We are going to be sewing the facing on next, but having it pressed will help with the next step. Next, you're going to want to sew the facing. First, you're going to want to fold your facing in half and sew the back seam. Go ahead and press it open. And then we're going to attach it very similarly to how we attach the crown to the brim. You want to make it sure that you're attaching it so that the facing encases all of that seam allowance, as well as after we have made this hat, we're going to be making a little bit of a structure to really help hold everything together so that the hat stays nice and stiff. That's going to help also hold that casing up. My camera was not on when I did this step. That's why we are just talking through it right now. Next, we are going to bind the edges of the brim. I chose to use a grosgrain, so I'm using this grosgrain ribbon. I'm going to fold it in half and iron it so that it is easily prepped and I can easily add it on. After I used the grosgrain, it was not my favorite look. I wish I would have used some bias. The bias would have stretched a little bit nicer, creating a more clean final look, whereas the grosgrain, as you will see, got a little bit bunchy, I guess I could say, but it was not nearly as clean. Once I have the length prepped that I'm going to need to go all the way around my hat, I'm going to go ahead and start putting it around my hat. I'm going to start by encompassing the edge of the brim as well as the wire. The wire is going to help give the brim some shape and some stiffness at the edge. So I'm going to encase the wire and the edge of the brim, and I'm going to pin it all the way around. Once you are fully pinned, you have a couple of options. You can either hand stitch this on or machine sew it on. I chose to machine sew it on. I'm going to move back over to my sewing machine. I'm going to slide the brim underneath the sewing machine, and then I'm going to pull my pins as I slowly work my way around. This is the much faster way to go about adding this on. However, it is not the most clean way to go. Like I said earlier, this did cause my edge binding to kind of have a few little bubbles in it, not be as crisp as I would like it. If I were to do this over again, I would definitely use bias tape for one, not grosgrain, and I would probably hand sew it on so that it had a really nice, clean, and professional look. However, when you're under a timeline and you don't have the extra time to hand sew it, you can put it on by machine really fast. Once the edge is bound, I'm going to do one layer of felt stiffener spray, specifically on the inside and on the underside of the hat. Once I have that, I am going to flip it over and do a light dusting on the top as well, and have that be a first light coat, not super heavy, to begin. Once that's done, I'm going to make a stiffener for the inside. I'm going to use a dinner placemat for the structure, so I'm going to cut out my plastic pattern. The plastic pattern has seam allowance only on one of the back seams, and it is 1/2 inch smaller than the original brim. I'm going to start by taping together the back seam of the crown, and then I'm going to put on the top crown. I'm going to do this first by clipping into the seam allowance of the top crown seam so that I can fold up the edges of the top part of the crown and it will nicely fit inside the side crown. I am then going to slide the top crown into the side crown and make sure it is taped really well and fully secure. Test try on of the demon hat base while the demon hat is currently drying with some stiffener in it. And it says,
"Stay humble and kind."
Always stay humble and kind.
Which is kind of ironic.
Yeah, that demon definitely needs some reminding. So we put it on the inside, facing outward. Once the hat stiffener has dried, I'm going to insert the new hat base I created, and I'm going to place a little glue onto the facing that's sewn on there, and then I'm going to put the facing up to the stiffener we just created. This will then cover up the bottom edge of that stiffener and keep it nice and soft for whoever's wearing this hat. Next is to do a couple more rounds of stiffener specifically on the brim. I found that once I had the sturdy inside for the crown, I did not really need to put much more stiffener on that part. After you've done a few coats on the hat, it's time to make the chin strap. I decided to make my chin strap out of these black beads and these multicolored dark beads. I thought it would be a nice look to alternate them. I wish I could have gotten beads that were a little bit more reminiscent of what it looked like on screen. However, none of the stores in my local area had anything, and Amazon couldn't get me beads that I liked within 2 weeks. So I was stuck to find something that I was happy with. So I just alternated these two beads, and I am fairly happy with the result. Once you have the length of chin strap that you desire, it is time to sew it on. I placed my hat on the edge of a table and began sewing. I had knots in the end so that the beads wouldn't fall off. This is what I went through, as well as the felt, to make sure that those beads are on there good and tight. And take a look at it. He looks so good. And there you have it, your very own Jinu-inspired hat. Whether you're wearing it for a cosplay, for a shoot, for Halloween, or just because you love the look and you now have this structured, dramatic hat piece that stands out. I'll be making more of Jinu's full costume soon, so make sure you like and subscribe to not miss any of those pattern pieces. And if you're interested in learning how to digitally draft, whether it's your own hat or your own clothes, check out my Clo 3D Quick Start course. You can find it in the link below. Thank you so much for sewing with me, and I will see you in some of my other videos. Happy sewing!